right, hello, and thank you all for joining us in this installment of Lawn Chair Philosophy's Continental Chop Shop Series, wherein we explore crucial notions around which conversations in the continental tradition revolve. I want to thank each and every one of you all for joining us today, and those participating asynchronously for listening to the thoughts we'll share today. We hope you enjoy. Today's theme is freedom, an especially timely theme as we struggle to define what sort of autonomy governments across the globe ought to recognize and enforce through legislation. I can't speak with authority over matters elsewhere in the world, but here in America, freedom is often taken to be the right of an individual to do or say whatever they want with no restraint. And the standards by which we allow certain folks to do just that, while prohibiting others from doing the same, are simultaneously obfuscated and very clear to anyone paying attention. Throughout our discussion today, we'll see that freedom in the history of philosophy and the continental tradition, especially the continental tradition, this notion of freedom is more nuanced than doing or saying whatever one wants because one can. And we'll see that freedom is more entangled with truth and judgment or comportment, responsibility, and self-accountability than our typical everyday approach to freedom proclaims. I hope our philosophical exploration of this theme might inform political discussions out in the world for the sake of clarity and harmony, but we shall see. I'll start off the discussion with Husserl's notion of freedom. Then I'll cover a little bit of Heidegger. I admit I am not a Heidegger expert. However, Angela Heredia, our usual Heidegger and Fanon speaker, had a last-minute matter to attend to and couldn't make it. Everything's okay. It's just an extenuating circumstance, but I'll keep that presentation brief and restrain myself from drawing too many Husserl parallels. I've gotten myself in trouble for doing that in the past. So I did ask Angela for a little bit of help. She gave me some resources that we'll put in our Google Drive for folks to reference. And any mistake that I make today is not Angela's fault. It's my own. So we'll keep that brief. Then we'll turn to Dr. Kimberly Engels of Molloy University to discuss Sartre's notion of freedom. And then finally, we'll turn to Giorgi Vachnadze of Tbilisi University for a discussion on Merleau-Ponty's notion of freedom. If there are no other commencing comments or questions, we may go ahead and begin. Any commencing comments or questions? No. All right. So I'll begin with my Husserl presentation. I'll explore Husserl's implementation of freedom through the themes of the lived body or the animate body and kinesthesis, the presuppositionlessness that he's looking for in his phenomenology, or what he's striving for, and epistemic responsibility to autonomous self-responsibility, as well as eidetic free variation and the spontaneity of active comportment. So starting with the lived or animate body, the lived body for Husserl is more than just the mere natural body that is determined by mechanical motivations, the systems of our body, any sort of laws of nature, any impulses that might become out of that body. This lived body involves sensation and a freedom of movement. It's a locus for our point of view. All that is seen from our human perspective can be drawn to a sort of 0 point of that lived body. So we have a sort of parallel with the lived body in Husserl and the sort of juxtaposition between freedom of reason and the sort of heteronomy of the body that we find in Kant. So according to Kant, the problem of freedom emerges in looking at the motivations of our actions as they're on display in our bodily actions. We have determinations from nature that operates on mechanical laws and through laws of sequencing and causality. However, we can cause action using pure reason. So how do these causal forces interact, especially given that pure reason, according to Kant, is not subject to the laws of time and space? This sort of freedom is problematic. Kant believes that through following, his formulas in the categorical imperative and the reflections in his critique of pure reason, we can come to know the actions of pure reason, how it is our judgments come to shape our perceptions, and how we can be motivated by ideas generated out of the activity of pure reason, especially pure practical reason, the notion of God and the freedom and immortality. But Kant gets himself into a little bit of trouble. Some views from the Kantian perspective allow him to get out of trouble. And I think especially if we reference his writings on religion and anthropology, we might find a tap dance to get him out of trouble. But I am often compelled by Husserl's critique that this notion of pure reason in Kant is a mythical construction, as Husserl says in The Crisis, that this sort of autonomous freedom is not arbitrary, and we do find that motivation within the lived body, but there is no such thing as pure reason that is completely free from different life forces, whether they be emotion or natural laws or of our relationship to other people. The freedom within the lived body is a little more nuanced or maybe confused, we might see. But Husserl wants to get beyond this rationalitate, this pure reason, to a broader scope of human processing and reasoning that happens on different levels, the theoretical, the practical, but also the axiological, our emotional valuing, and any other sort of valuing that's happening, how they converge together in this lived body, and how we understand certain levels of freedom. We can't unpack all these different dimensions of freedom so long as we are beholden to this notion of a pure reason. Yes. So the lived body, according to Husserl, is motivated by our bodily impulses, yes, by natural law, sure, but also social influences, norms, trends, the style of our culture, the style of our upbringing, our history, our expectations, our imaginations, ideals. This lived body we can find isolated in its fullness in what Husserl calls the spirit realm. He speaks of that in Ideas too. But we first get to know this lived body through a kinesthesis, an ownness. Even though he does critique Kant's notion of pure reason and the sort of autonomy tied to it, Husserl's going to say Kant wasn't totally wrong. There are good reasons for developing that theory, and that theory does reflect a certain aspect of our relationship to reality and how it is the subject constructs an understanding or notion of reality alongside this world as it's given. So we experience this body as a physical thing amidst other physical things in this world, yes, but also this is my body. I can choose to move my arm in this direction or that direction. I can choose to save my money or spend it frivolously and use my body to do that. I take ownership of this body. It is mine. Your body is your body. They are distinct. And this body is a locus for our experiences and for our cognitional activity, a meeting point between all the dimensions of our understanding. So this lived body and recognizing lived body as such provides us an opportunity to perform his phenomenological reduction. Yes, I experience this body as something I control. That is our natural way of viewing the body. In our everyday practical affairs, we take accountability for our actions, and we seem to be in control of this body, at least in a certain extent. Our automatic functions we don't control, but we can control our actions. But whenever we strip away our presuppositions about this ownership, we can see where it derives. It derives from the way we naturally reflect upon ourselves as we go about attending everyday matters. It has to do with a certain purposiveness that is involved in our perception. So we see, we get a sense for the I can with our body. I can move my eye this way and that way. And so you can too. This lived body helps us, and autonomy helps us recognize other people. And we see this world in a way that reflects the I can. I can manipulate these things around me and flip through this book or smack you in the face with this book, do whatever I want with this world. So we see the world and ourselves as something that we can manipulate. But that sense of self is something that we construct. Again, it's not an arbitrary construction, but we can get beyond this sort of purposive element, synthesizing our perception of the world by tapping into the natural, perceptive self-reflection that's happening as we are going about our world practically and building a sense of self and a sense of world through our activities. So our perception is naturally directed towards the world, typically directed towards the world in a practical way, and we see ourselves as capable and the world as something that we can manipulate. But happening at the same time as this direct perception is a sort of reflecting back upon ourselves. It's happening in the background, but we're reflecting on our relationship to the world and building taxonomies, really, building a sense of essences. My essence of self, the sort of personalistic attitude that develops out of this understanding, the essence of drums as I come to know them as a drummer. The more and more I practice, the more solidified and clear the essence of drum becomes in the background of my perception. We build up prejudice naturally, but also sort of spontaneously out of this lived body. And whenever we suspend our typical way of viewing the world and attend to the activity of perception, we see a different sort of freedom happening here. So this kinesthesis of the freely moved sense organ, the body as a locus of the will, that again isn't arbitrary, but it is something that we have constructed in the background of our perception as we go about the world. And we could know ourselves in other ways. So we can use his reduction to suspend our natural way of viewing things. And we can suspend our general understandings of time and space and all of the scientific notions that restrict our understanding of nature. And in sort of the first performance of this reduction, we arrive at a transcendental ego, where we have this pattern of the ego or cogito, the cogitatio, or the acts of consciousness, and the object pole, the cogitatum, the meaningful object that sits before consciousness. We see this pattern sort of at the heart of every single action that we make. Whether that action be a judgment or a movement of the body, whatever way that we understand ourselves, typically that just becomes a mode of givenness amongst other forms of givenness of self, besides bodily comportment. We find that in this reduction. So with that pattern of the ego, cogitatio, cogitatum, the world could be given any sort of way as a mode of consciousness, and this ego, this self, could be given any other way. It could be given really through as related to this body and the emotions involved with it, and our practical concerns, our upbringing, our history, our expectations, all of it. Or we could just see this subject as it could be in any setting. Its way of concern for an object in any sort of setting, and whatever object it might be concerned with. So we supposedly, according to Husserl, see the ego in its presuppositionlessness. And we have a sort of epistemic responsibility to get in touch with this transcendental ego in order to actualize autonomous self-responsibility. We must know ourselves, and go back to that creed of Socrates. However, just isolating this transcendental ego in abstraction to see formally that it is the pattern of cognition and of comportment for all subjects in all possible scenarios, we do not realize that ego in full until we situate it in a sort of absolute concrete situation. We want to see it in immediacy, as it is comporting through the muck and the mire of the situation in which it finds itself, through its historicity, whether that be a grand cultural history and the norms that come with it, or something more local, and having to do with your upbringing. To see the transcendental ego at play in concretion, that will lead to a sort of autonomous self-responsibility. And that does not involve doing whatever you want with your body. We are following Husserl's precise method, and it will be very hard to identify the transcendental ego amidst all of that concretion, especially since this transcendental ego is not subject to natural laws of time and space, and is not subject to sequence in a similar way that pure reason is not subject to natural laws in Kant. But Husserl wants to distinguish his project from Kant, because he's talking about a broader sort of rationality and not this mythical construction. Husserl does kind of get himself into some issues here, because how do you identify amidst all that action this abstract pattern at play, if this abstract pattern at play is what conditions the possibility to recognize a circumstance as a circumstance to begin with? Oh my goodness. I believe that Husserl can get away with it in his writings on time consciousness. And this is quite a charitable view, but as a drummer, I am particularly drawn to this. If we attend this absolute concrete situation as an inner phenomenological moment, of time consciousness, where we are immersed in a fixed now, where time is proceeding, like the world is coming at us, we experience it, and then that experience goes back into the recesses of memory, and new experiences are constantly flooding this now, but the pattern of the now stays fixed. And within this now, there's sort of a stormy sea of motivations, of expectation built upon memory. We have protension, our expectations, and retention, our memory. And again, all these levels of understanding that are coming into play. Our emotions, our essences and ideals and cultural norms and motivations. So to be able to distinguish all of those levels and also attend to the transcendent object that sits before consciousness as a sort of pattern. We don't want to call it a thing within this absolute realm, but there is a pattern which the subject is attending. And when we are within this inner phenomenological time consciousness, or that realm, sort of realm of essences appears that is alive and moving and active. And Husserl has this notion of a sort of primary memory and a secondary, or a primary now and a sort of, primary retention and a secondary retention. So as a moment in which we are comporting ourselves towards the world in a general way, where we're just understanding our context through patterns that we cannot name, but we can identify very vaguely. As it starts to pass into the recesses of our memory, there is a short moment where that which was or is and becoming was, and that which is about to be, sort of converge, and we can compare in immediacy the judgments that were made just then, the activity that was made, and how it is being synthesized with this new moment. In that way, we can achieve a sort of presuppositionless understanding, self-evidence, upon which any sort of objective standard of measure is beholden, to which it is beholden. I don't know if that is satisfactory. Again, there's as a drummer, I'm very drawn to that. According to Husserl, the pattern of the flow of internal time is unique to every person, but it is even. It's like a metronome. And because that pattern is the same, we're able to sort of reactivate memories, bring them to the fore. And even though when we bring a memory to the fore, we're not experiencing that past moment as we originally did, we can authentically bring it into play and analyze past judgments in a scientific way to get in touch with our inner worlds and express them in a way that others can understand. We're supposed to build a sort of rational empathy here. So whenever we understand ourselves in this radical way, we can recognize the other in that radical way. We can sort of like, you can meet someone as deeply as they have met themselves. So if you know yourself that deeply, you can connect with others on a very deep level. And we can have a science of this inner sort of life world. I think we can in a very vague way share what's happening in this realm of inner phenomenological time consciousness, and in that way instantiate a presuppositionless science. But again, that science is very narrow, and it is dependent upon his notion of free variation, of the sort of receptiveness of consciousness and its free activity. So I'm going to turn to that lastly. the formation of essences and eidetic variation or imaginative free variation, again, these are happening spontaneously in the background of perception. And Husserl wants to use his phenomenology to set aside our typical straightforward way of dealing with the world and look at what's happening over here in perception. So the development of essences, even though we're talking about free variation, their development is motivated and constrained, both formally and contextually. So again, there is a system of taxonomy that's being built up. One that could be morphological or precise, depending on what sort of domain of inquiry or science you're dealing with. For example, certain essences in science, the essence of Fahrenheit or the essence of a molecule, we can see that more or less clearly than the essence of a human being or the essence of meaning. That's going to be a little more vague. But all essences are constrained by the domain of concern out of which they are developed. And we can never think of this free variation as happening in a pure space, free from any relation to time and space, in the way that Kant sees pure reason. So I have an example of drumming. Say that my feet are doing good. I did such a good job playing that drum beat on my feet. Oh, but my hands, they sounded so janky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to practice today and just isolate my hands. So as I'm just working on my hands, I'm restricting my focus. I'm not really paying so much attention to my feet, but my fingers and my form and my wrists. But as I'm doing so, it's not as if my hand has been detached from my body and is not related to everything else that's going on in this context. So the domain of handsness and any essence about my drummer hands, as I am attending that pure essence, I'm always attending it in relation to how it is developed. So this focusing attention on a certain domain allows us to see how essences belong to certain domains. It wouldn't make sense to talk about the essence of drumming rudiments in a conversation about, I don't know, the essence of good taste in culinary school. I don't know, maybe as an analogy, but I don't know. Husserl wants to say that certain essences have their place and they are generated in certain domains. And even though our imagination is making free judgments and contributing to the development of these essences spontaneously, the development of essences is constrained by the domains to which they are beholden, and the way that we are able to behold this free variation. We're very constrained. We have to follow Husserl's method. We have to be very scientific about it. And only in that way can we achieve universal eidetic insight about the grounding of objective value, how it emerges originally, and how we are responsible for the development of these essences, even though they're kind of happening naturally without our notice, typically. So we have freedom there. Now, what we find within these constraints, even though they are constraints, still is an infinite wellspring of original thought and possibilities. The world as a phenomenon, as we perceive it, whenever we look at that world in terms of our perception and this eidetic free variation, we see a world presented through all the ways that it could be. And so when we see the world as we perceive it in relation to the world as it could be, as they are at play together in the realm of interphenomenological time consciousness, then we have a robust understanding of self and freedom, even though that freedom is limited, and there is a hefty responsibility that comes with that sort of freedom. And I hope that these insights are freeing. Yeah, so that's all I have for Husserl. I'm going to stop there for questions and discussion. Oh, we've had some participants. Hello, Gerald and Jose. Good to see you. Good to see you. Oh, any questions from the chat or from you all? But ask a question or a comment. Any parallels that we can draw? Oh, we could move on. I could go on and on and on about Husserl all day. Since I had to prepare for Heidegger as well, I didn't do what I usually do and like write a strict paper. So I do hope that I wasn't rambly and that all that was kind of organized. If there are questions later on, I'm always available to chat about some Husserl. So we can go ahead and move on if we're good to do so. Okay. So let's turn to Heidegger quickly. Again, I skew very Husserl on themes, especially given, oh my gosh, Heidegger said so many terrible things about Husserl, and Husserl was his teacher. Husserl had a Jewish background, even though he converted to Lutheranism in the late 1800s. With the rise of the Nazi Party and Heidegger's affiliation with that Nazi Party, Heidegger kind of turned on his teacher, even though Husserl gave him so much to work with his phenomenology and helped him along in his career so much that he wrote to someone at one point, "I want to wring the old man's neck." So I admittedly am a bad phenomenologist, and I don't keep up with as much Heidegger as I should. This chop shop it did give me an opportunity to delve into him some more, and I admittedly do find many things that are compelling there. Angela, we miss you here, and your insights would definitely be very helpful. But I do appreciate the opportunity to be humbled by Heidegger and to get past my anger issues with him. So now Heidegger criticizes Husserl for getting caught up in the scientific language of subject and object passed down from the moderns into the Enlightenment period. We see that with his ego, cogitatio, and cogitatum. And even though Husserl wants to situate that pattern in a concrete situation, and he has a robust ontology, I mean, he is borrowing the language of Leibniz and the language of Descartes. And even though he uses Greek words, which I'll get to, he is restricted by that reflective language. So Heidegger wants to uncover a greater ontological being at the heart of our existence and constituting our self-knowledge and interpretation. This being, or Dasein, is always existentially at stake, always a sort of problem for itself. That is, Dasein can comport itself towards existence or a way of life in any myriad of ways. As Charles Gugnon puts it, in existing, Dasein decides its existence, whether it does so by taking hold or by neglecting. This characterization of human being is summed up by saying that Dasein is just is a relation to itself. What constitutes Dasein's being is that, according to Heidegger, in its being, it has a being relationship toward that being, end quote. So Husserl has an understanding of self-understanding, and we are, as subjects, preoccupied with ourselves, but that self-understanding is sort of relegated to the background of perception, and is laden with this language of Leibniz monad and reflection, and Heidegger wants to get beyond that. So Husserl believes that the subject is naturally preoccupied with itself, even if indirectly while absorbed in the activities of everyday life, but Heidegger criticizes Husserl's use of reflective apperception, whereas Husserl finds the start of phenomenology in the latent transcendentalism in Descartes. Husserl reaches back into the vocabulary of the Greeks to reach the absolute ground of meaning and to clarify the potentially free motivation of our actions. This is not to say that Husserl doesn't make use of Greek words, but in his ontology, Husserl is quite formal and relies on an isolated construction of the human subject and its world of objective value to ground his presuppositionless science. And in his formal and transcendental logic, mathematics plays a crucial role in revealing that ontological sphere for Husserl. And Heidegger goes, this is too abstract. It's too modern and too enlightenment driven, too scientifically driven. Those are all constructs, and being need not comport itself in a scientific way. So Heidegger looks towards the Greek notions of poiesis and praxis to situate the free unfolding of being in the natural world through the human perspective. As those terms are encumbered, or Husserl's terms are encumbered with the mechanics of the modern age and reveal, as those terms, the Greek notions are unencumbered with the mechanics of the modern age and reveal the beginnings of Western conversations of causality that have painted us into this corner of transcendental purity and confusion concerning agential freedom. This sort of strict dichotomy between subject and object was not present in Greek thought. So let's go back there, Heidegger says. See where this causality starts. So he takes us back to Aristotle to look at the sort of motivations to which the human animal is susceptible. We have first order desires and appetites determining our motions and actions. We are also capable of being driven by second order desires concerned with the worth of our actions. There exists a tension begot by the influence of impulse and of reasoning. Two different types of actions result, poiesis and praxis. Poiesis means to make, generally, and Heidegger appropriates that term and takes it to be the creative or manipulative action that's driven by practical goals. For example, I strike the drum head with my stick in a certain way to produce a desired sound. And practice entails actions done for the sake of becoming something. I think about how I hit my drum example in order to take the potential of my being and craft it into a drummer. So my concern is of drummingness itself instead of producing a specific a sound, practically speaking. So Heidegger holds that most human actions take both forms. There's a desired outcome that we wish, and a second order drive to become something. We want to actualize our potential through habits and the like. However, Heidegger says the second ordered motivations of praxis, the for which behind careful attention to the mode of our actions, is often covered over when we are absorbed in those acts. We get caught up in practical standards and norms, which are not arbitrary, but in comparison to our greater ontological being, they are idle chit-chat. We are taken away from our authentic being whenever we get caught up in the anonymous they in a sort of state of fallenness. So I'll take it back to more drumming examples. When I am practicing, even alone with the metronome by myself, I still have in my mind all that my teacher taught me, all that my band director taught me, all these standards of norm, what it means to be a good drummer, what the techniques that I have to do to produce certain sound, break it down and very scientifically, these are techniques that anyone can take on, and this sort of almost free-floating or authoritative force a drummer ought to do this. They say that you ought to do that. This expertise that comes into play. So there's a sort of anonymous they. What would one do in this situation when you want to be a good drummer? One ought to do this, and one can do this. I see parallels here between kinesthesis and Husserl, the I can, and what's happening in this they. Husserl thinks that, because I can move my body in this way, and I see that you can move your body in that way, your there can become my here and vice versa. But this sort of autonomous they, the general anyone, is a sort of groundless being. So when we are in a state of fallenness, we get absorbed in getting things done, checking things off of our list, making sure that our technique is formal and precise, and doing all that we ought to do to actualize that potential. And we need to do that. Fallenness isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not a state of sin. It's part and parcel of beings unfolding. It can bring a sort of collective effort of establishing, stabilizing standards, and an otherwise groundless creation of value. I mean, being can comport itself and actualize itself in any sort of way. That's overwhelming thinking about those possibilities. So this anonymous they, and the standards that become of applying that they to certain crafts or fields or domains is helpful. But we do fall into a sort of state of inauthenticity, being caught up in that they. Our fallenness makes it hard for us to own up to our actions as individuals. Who was responsible for my acts? Even in a silly example as drumming, was that me responsible for the sound I made, or was I just following the directions from my band director how many ever years ago that have been so sedimented that the idea to do what I did came up as original, but really it was just, other people's standards. Who am I if but a constant unfolding of being? Am I an agental agent, really? It's hard to tell from that perspective. Freedom helps Heidegger respond to these questions. Again, Charles Guignon writes, if being caught up in average everydayness makes our doings unfree, or more precisely, puts them outside the free/unfree distinction altogether, then being authentic should be a condition for our actions being characterizable as free. In authenticity, we do indeed stand behind our actions. We own them and can own up to them. The actions are ours, where that means we can more or less wholeheartedly identify with them. End quote. There is a clear-sightedness to authenticity, standing in the truth, so to speak. And that wholeness and awareness of our motivations is a sort of freedom where we can become what we are. So I want to take a look at Being in Time, section 146, Heidegger writes, understanding can devote itself primarily to the disclosedness of the world. That is, Dasein can proximately and for the most part understand itself in terms of its world, or else understanding throws itself primarily into the for the sake of which, that is, Dasein exists as itself. Understanding is either authentic, arising out of one's own self as such, or inauthentic. So this authenticity and the sort of freedom that comes in, recognizing both the poiesis and praxis in our actions can lead to a sort of truth and in authenticity, and we can call that freedom. He also allows for a sort of freedom that the world brings, as we saw in that quote. The world itself brings a sort of freedom to the table. Here, freedom is understood as a clearing or a disclosedness of the world. Heidegger believes that we can approach the world in a presuppositionless way to see the world as a sort of playground of possibilities for Dasein to choose itself by acting in this or that manner. whenever we are open to the world and its possibilities by freeing ourselves of prejudice, the way that we typically interpret the world and ourselves, we are letting ourselves be bound by the world. So even though we have a sense of freedom here, it's very limiting and humbling to be bound by the world, and that is freedom. As beings, big beings, we are beings towards something. Our actions are always directed and motivated, and this directedness involves expectations as well. We must conclude with the ultimate expectation, of which we can know nothing: death. Heidegger speaks of a sort of freedom towards death that will reveal something about this disclosedness and this presuppositionless and the humbling of being bound to the world. So he speaks of a freedom towards death. In death, we are not. We do not have being. And so we cannot know the essence of death, for knowing is an activity of being. And whenever we run towards death, as Heidegger puts it, our fallenness is revealed to us, that we are too caught up in lists and goals and the practical aspects of our actualization to see our greater being. Here, when we have an authentic relationship to death, we find transcendence in Heidegger. For as Charles Gunyon writes, freeing up the true meaning of death allows Dasein to gain an insight normally concealed from it, and on the basis of insight, to transform itself. This freedom of surpassing or passing beyond the manifold of particular possibilities, or maybe our more practical ones, are opened up by the public, or that anonymous they is called transcendence. So I have a very, maybe even morbid and TMI example of this, but it's such a good example. Trigger warning for you all. It's about to get personal here. So I suffer from terrible chronic stomach pain. I've got some ulcerative colitis. But before I was diagnosed with that, I would just have these awful pains that would bring on panic attacks. And there were also some mental health issues. And at the height of my illness, I would have these episodes where I would be vomiting and other things and shaking uncontrollably and having these hallucinations where I thought I was going to die, as anybody having a panic attack can attest to. But then I just was so caught up in all that pain, I couldn't see out of it. And then I thought I was actually dying. And then that I had already died, and I'm on the bathroom floor wondering if I am actually dead. Coming out of those moments, once the morning would come and I'm kind of calmed down and I've sort of argued my way to clarity with death, saying, well, if I'm dead, I'm here and I am in some sort of way, using Heidegger to sort of, keep myself from doing something hasty. I come back refreshed. I feel, very drained, but also kind of peaceful. And my priorities have been completely shifted. It's not as if that was a near-death experience. It wasn't as if I got hit by a car or was terribly wounded. It was a psychological event. But still, after these moments, I come refreshed. What are my basic needs that I need to take care of? This body, and what are these activities that I'm getting into that are causing me so much stress that my body is completely reacting against it? I'm getting too caught up in the rat race of trying to publish, of practicing my rudiments to no end in order to perfect my style and be the best, so that I can get attention for being the best and get the gig and get paid and get the attention, getting caught up in those standards that are really just groundless. Oh, my body naturally brings me back down to that ground. And even though it's not a literal confrontation with death, I find those experiences to be good. Not that I should work myself up into a frenzy so that I end up there anyways, but I think it is an example of what Heidegger is talking about here. This sort of this inhale, exhale movement of Dasein. We have this sort of fullness combination, this sort of clarity of our potential and how we ought to, or how we could authentically actualize it. Certain socially established norms that can help us refine that actualization, but again, those are just practical norms, and there is a freedom to being that can choose. And so we naturally will fall, which does kind of resemble radical evil in Kant, if I'm going to be honest. But that's an aside, and that's an argument we can take. But this and Kant would describe that as a sin. And so this way, not to get too crazy here, I going on tangents, but I really do see a sort of Neoplatonist, pseudo-Dionysian aspect here with Dasein. This fallenness is not a sin. Dasein does come back to itself in some way, shape, or form. You will be confronted with death, and a certain sort of clarity and feeling that an encounter with death brings reveals that inauthenticity and allows us to sort of regroup and understand these different levels of freedom. So I hope I wasn't too rambly on that. That is all I have to say. Again, I wanted to keep that kind of short because I'm not a Heidegger expert, but I hope I did a good job and at least given the broad strokes. And if anybody has questions or wants to fill in on that, I open the floor now to you all.
I have a question, from your exploration, what do you think is the biggest kind of way that Husserl kind of that Heidegger deviates from Husserl when it comes to freedom?
When it comes to freedom, I think personally, and with my very limited understanding of Heidegger, that this ontological freedom of being to choose the world, even though that world is giving is a radical deviation. We understand, or Husserl, say we. I'm such a Husserl fan that I just identify with him. So Husserl will understand the relationship between the subject and the world as pre-given and as beholden to that pattern of subject and object. Now he gives room for maybe subconscious motivations, but if it's subconscious, we can't be aware of it and we can't scientifically address it. But for Heidegger, even though he has a concept of thrownness, we always find ourselves always amidst a world that is unfolding, that contains preconceived notions and norms and social values and historicity and all of that. The being of being and its comportment towards that world is not restricted by that precise scientific relationship between subject and object. The world, in an ontological way, in its primal being, is not an object. Now, I think that we see that too in Husserl, in his interphenomenological time consciousness, when the world is just patterns and the subject, we're not, we're using the language of subject to talk about it, but we don't perceive ourselves as subject. We are just acting, and we know ourselves through that action. And so I don't personally think that Heidegger gets very far from Husserl. I don't think that he detracts too much from him. I think he completes his project. There are those who will vehemently argue another side, but that's my take on it. And the way that Husserl goes about determining the realm of ontology, first and foremost, he goes about that scientifically. Like, we have to isolate this ontology methodically in his formal and transcendental logic. he says that, naturally we're making sort of judgments, not judgments in the way that the science of logic understands it first and foremost, but we're comporting towards the world, and there are certain judgments, comportments that harmonize with each other, certain comportments that don't harmonize with each other, and we can sort of build up laws of logic and proper reasoning without referencing the correctness of that reasoning in relationship to an object. But once we bring in mathematics, we start to unfold a realm of formal ontology. We see judgments in relationship to that which is. And then from there, we can build up this structure of anything, whatever. So we need mathematics to help us scientifically unfold what it means to be any object whatsoever, what that formally means for logic, and what that formally means for constituting the possibility of establishing truth and at least adequate knowledge, not precise knowledge, but adequate knowledge. And I think, and even though Husserl will have us then descend into a deeper realm of being that's concrete, Husserl wants us to first go through the science and then dive in, whereas I see Heidegger as maybe just diving in head first and seeing how those scientific values arise and why we might comport ourselves in that way. So as a charitable reading of Heidegger to go against my Husserlian instincts, there is a divide there. I'll concede. I don't want to, but I have to.
On the same note, I'm really interested about the role of anxiety in maybe you did talk about this, but I want us to talk maybe more about this. Like, what is the role of Heideggerian anxiety in our finding or failing to find our way out of inauthentic facticity and towards freedom?
Yeah. Now, I, again, am not an expert, and I'm not going to have as good of an answer to this as the one about ontology, because I don't have a Husserl comparison to make. But from my knowledge, there's this natural tension that is created between our practical drives and this sort of authentic drive of being to want to actualize itself and realize itself. And that tension provides a sort of opportunity. I think without that tension and anxiety, there isn't movement forward in that practical realm. I see maybe here a potential to use that anxiety to push you forward. But at a certain point, as in my case, I'll use that anxiety to keep pushing me forward until my body collapses, and then I have a wild panic attack on the bathroom floor. And then I'm going to be faced with death or with just ultimate limitations, and then I am forced to deal with my inauthenticity. And at least in my moments of having these episodes, there is a clarity where that anxiety is relieved, because I'm like, okay, I am going to focus on these more primal necessities and how it is I'm going to continue in this world so that Dasein can speak through me. But on that note, in certain regards, Heidegger, it seems like Heidegger takes a Nietzschean route in that this Dasein is speaking through us. So how much of this anxiety can we control? How many self-help tips can we take on to relieve that anxiety? Is that anxiety something that we ought to try to relieve? Will it just naturally dissipate when we've had a humbling encounter with death and come to some sort of clarity and reprioritize ourselves? I'm not sure. I know that there is a lot of literature on that, and I can do some research and post that in our Google Drive. But I think at least that tension is something that will persist. It must persist, and it does point to the origin of our interpretation and our value creation. Yeah, I don't know. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, no, that's very good. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I did so much better in this Heidegger presentation than the last one I had to give. So I'm glad it was helpful. But again, take what I'm saying with Heidegger with a grain of salt and do some more research. Yeah. Any other questions? Maybe from the chat? How are y'all doing in there? Everybody doing good? Okay. Well, if we are satisfied, at least for now, with Husserl and Heidegger, we can move on to Sartre. Okay, Kimberly Engels, you go ahead and take it away.
All right. So I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. Okay, so, if there's a single word that Sartre is most affiliated with, it's usually freedom. But I titled this presentation Sartre's Concepts of Freedom, plural, because Sartre's conception of freedom actually changed considerably over the course of his career and the course of his life, and you find a different conception of freedom in his later works than you find in his earlier works. And usually when someone wants you to speak on Sartre and freedom, they want you to speak on Sartre's earlier works. I actually do more work on Sartre's later work, and I'm more sympathetic to the positions that he arrived at later in his life. So I tend to, when I talk about his work and his corpus, I look at it holistically, at the whole thing. So which view of freedom, when we talk about Sartre and freedom, I always say, well, which view of freedom are you talking about? Most people affiliate Sartre's view of freedom with his works Existentialism as a Humanism and Being in Nothingness. Existentialism as a Humanism is obviously one of his most accessible texts. It's easy to read. It's easy to teach to undergraduates. It's also, not a work that he himself identified with much past, giving that lecture. He kind of gave the lecture on a bit of a whim. And it wasn't something that he wanted to be seen as like his defining work in the way that it is often seen. Being in Nothingness, obviously a much more longer, robust text, and it's there that you really flesh out his earlier conception of freedom. In Being in Nothingness, freedom is really seen as this absolute, unconditional aspect of human existence that we find in humans' free consciousness. And the, classic French existentialism, this radically free to choose who you are, that is fashionable in existentialism, is really found in that text. Later Sartre, there's a pivot in his work when he started to become more influenced by Marxism, more influenced by materiality, sociality. He just became a bit more realistic, I think, in terms of, the experiences that he himself had and more exposure to the limitedness of the human situation. So he wrote The Critique of Dialectical Reason, volumes 1 and 2. Volume 2 was never actually finished. And also this view of freedom comes out in some of his later essays, like A Plea to Intellectuals, or some of his later lectures, like the Rome lecture or his Cornell lecture called Morality and History. Basically, his later vision of ethics, that was kind of grounded in this idea of integral humanity, really teases out this more restricted view of freedom. And so in this later view, freedom is more of a negotiation amidst societal and situational constraints. And he calls these constraints the practico-inert. And so in my discussion of later Sartre, I'll flesh that term out more specifically. It's similar to when, Husserl might talk about sedimentation or something. But it's basically the way that the social, material, historical realm limits our ability to be free in a meaningful way. So early views of freedom, we have to understand his view of being, his ontology. So he divides being into the being for itself and the being in itself. Being in itself is matter in the physical world. He gives examples like an inkwell and a pen. You could also think about natural objects, trees, rocks. And he says that being in itself is being that, quote, is what it is. Essentially, it's beings that can coincide with its essence in a one-to-one relation. Okay, it simply is what it is. You know, a pen has its purpose as being something that writes. It can't reflect on that purpose. It can't change that purpose. You know, its essence is fixed. So it coincides with its essence in like this one-to-one relation. It's fully positive being. It cannot choose anything about its characteristics. Alternatively, we have being for itself. So this is the other kind of category of being that Sartre introduces, and this is human consciousness alone. We already have there's already issues that emerge with this dichotomy, right? Because what about animal consciousness? What about, could we say that there are a level of consciousness with plants that's different from, inanimate objects like a pen? So already just having this like dualism that he posits here, there's all kinds of questions that emerge from it. But this is really what he puts forth, at least in Being and Nothingness. He thinks there's something radically different between the human consciousness and all other types of beings. So being for itself, the human consciousness, he calls it spontaneous, free consciousness that assigns value to being in itself. So he says, being in itself is just kind of there. It's inert matter. It doesn't have any value assigned to it. And we, as a free consciousness, we organize it, give meaning to it, give value to it, and make it a world. And he says that being for itself encounters the physical world and differentiates itself from the environment. And through this process, it negatively constructs an image of what it's not. So he says the for itself can introduce this element of questioning, this element of doubt, and this element of differentiation. It can look at something like a book or a tree and say, that's not me. And by understanding that that is not me, you kind of negatively construct an image of what you are by differentiating yourself from other types of being. And he says being for itself builds an essence by affirming some possibilities and then annihilating others. So he talks about there's kind of the world presents kind of a field of possibilities in front of us. And we use our consciousness to bring some of those into reality, affirm some of those, and negate others, right? And so that's why our essence, we don't coincide with it in a one-to-one relation, because it can change, and it's something that we can choose. So a quote from Being and Nothingness, he says, human reality is its own surpassing toward what it lacks. It surpasses itself towards the particular being which it would be if it were what it is. So, the human consciousness, he says, it exists in the mode of being what it's not and not being what it is, because it doesn't have this direct one-to-one relation with its essence. Its essence is always in tension. Its essence is always in question. Its essence is always kind of in a process of becoming, or process of flux. So our subjectivity, our consciousness, our self emerges from an ongoing process of interaction with annihilation of the given, right? He says the human consciousness alone has this process of annihilation, this ability to introduce negative being, right? Being in itself is fully positive being. Being for itself can bring in the aspect of questioning, of doubt, of negation, of this is not going to be me. I'm going to be something else. Or this isn't me. What am I? Through this process, we build what he calls kind of our fundamental project, which is our choice of ourself in the world, kind of the goal that we have, that we organize all of our choices around. Yeah. So sometimes people think that, Sartre thinks that our choices are just like random or absurd, and he doesn't think that. He thinks that we have something called a fundamental project, which, we could say that maybe the fundamental project might be chosen randomly, but the everyday choices that we make them in light of this general idea of ourself that we have. So he gives his example of himself as a writer and a philosopher. He says, my fundamental project is as a writer. I get up in the morning and I make decisions that are all kind of based around that image that I have of myself as one who writes. But this is what's behind Sartre's famous claim. Everybody knows that he says that existence precedes essence. What does he mean by that? Well, our essence or nature is determined by our choice of project, and it's secondary to it. And our essence or nature can change. Okay, so we exist and then we choose a project. So we don't have, a blueprint. We don't have a pre-given way that we have to be, in the way that, he says an inkwell is an inkwell, a pen has its purpose as a pen. Our essence is not like that. We get to choose it. We get to direct ourselves into the world towards the goal that we want, towards the image of self that we want to be. But even in being in nothingness, we are only free in situation. Okay, so we're not just free to become anything that we want or to do anything that we want. So I'd like to use this example with students. I am not free to become the King of England. There are so many reasons that is not a realistic possibility for me. I'm the wrong gender. I'm not English. I'm not a member of the royal family. That's just never going to happen for me. So you're not free to just be anything. We're limited by many aspects of our situation, such as our class, race, gender, bodies, disability, nationality, citizenship. And Sartre refers to these limits as facticity. Okay, so these are the aspects of ourselves that are not something that we can just turn off or just choose. But we're simultaneously always facticity and transcendence. Okay, transcendence might be another way of referring to the free consciousness. So my free consciousness can always project meaning onto a situation and go beyond it. So while I cannot become the King of England, that is not ever going to be something that I can do. I still get to choose what meaning I give to that situation. I get to choose how I respond to it. I get to choose my attitude. I get to choose some other role that is more realistic for me that I could take on. So it's always an interplay, even in being in nothingness. It's not just I can do anything, I can be anything. It's a interplay between facticity and transcendence. Those two things, work together. So just a quote about the situation from being in nothingness. So he says, we do not appear first to ourselves to be thrown subsequently into enterprises. Our being is immediately in situation. That is, it arises in enterprises and knows itself first insofar as it is reflected in those enterprises. We discover ourselves then in a world peopled with demands, in the heart of projects. So the for itself kind of surges up into the world, but it surges up into a world that is already collectively valued and intersubjectively shared. It's not that we're thrown into a blank slate, we're thrown into a situation. And yes, it's up to our free consciousness what we do with that situation. We don't have to just go along with the values that are given to us. We don't have to, just go along with a life path that someone imposes on us. At the same time, we can't pretend that those things aren't there, because whatever project we choose, whatever essence we choose, is going to be built against the backdrop of that situation, in response to it, in a relation with it. So his early view of freedom, it's often referred to as radical freedom. He argues that our presence in the world is always characterized by freedom. It's an unconditional fact of our existence. And even though we are thrown into an already given situation, we can always use the power of our free consciousness to annihilate some possibilities, affirm others, and construct our essence in the world. Much like, Heidegger talked about anxiety, freedom for Sartre can be anguish-inducing. Because, he says we realize it's up to us. And he says, sometimes at our deepest level, we want someone to tell us what to do. We want the choice to be easy. We don't like having 10 different options of what we can do and, it being up to us what we want to choose. There's actually, some interesting TED Talks and some interesting studies, that capitalism has actually made people less happy because having so many choices and really nothing directing you towards one or the other is really anguish inducing. And it makes you feel like if you choose the wrong thing that, the choice was up to me. Or even now that we have like so many things that we can watch and we get to choose whatever we watch, now there's this pressure on you to choose something good and you don't want to waste your time. And before when there was just 3 channels, it's like, well, you just turn on and it's there for me and I just pick one. But now there's 1,000 things that you can watch and, it's like totally up to you what you want to see. And that process actually proves anguish, something that simple of like, what do I watch before I go to bed? But, you think at bigger things, coming to medical treatment, sometimes people want the doctor to give them a recommendation. So it makes sense what to do. They don't want this idea that like, they're just giving me 5 choices or 3 choices and it's just kind of all up to me which one I do. So he says we kind of crave direction. We crave sometimes less freedom. Because when we realize that it's up to us, then, that's a lot of pressure. And what if we fail? And what if we do a bad job at making one single choice or do a bad job at building our fundamental project, something bigger? Choose the wrong life path. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of Sartre's earlier view. There's more I could go into for this, but I want to get into some of his shifts in after he does the critique of dialectical reason, because I think they're important to really understand fully where his thought went in his later years. So while less attractive, or just not as fashionable, I guess, in existentialist circles, Critique of Dialectical Reason 1 and 2, and then also Search for a Method, and his later lectures, Sartre introduces a new way of even just talking about being. So he doesn't talk much about the for itself anymore. He starts talking about praxis. And so praxis, it refers to conscious activity. So it's still about the consciousness, but it also talks about the involvement or the interaction of that consciousness with the environment. So conscious activity, which totalizes all the various objects and perceptions of its environment into a continuous unity when pursuing our chosen ends. So really emphasizing the material interaction that we have, the physical interaction with our world. So consciousness no longer negates what is given. Okay, it's no longer this dialectic. It's more of a spiral, is how I describe it. What is given is incorporated and retained into praxis. So our project is constructed through a dialectical interaction of praxis with the reified and institutionalized results of previous human affairs. This includes things like manipulated physical matter, physical artifacts, even language, sociality, culture, class. All of these things are kind of, in being in nothingness, they were there more just kind of like as a backdrop, and we could take them or leave them. We could negate them, and just kind of choose. With this new concept of praxis and practico-inert, and the way that praxis is immediately implicated in a physical, social, historical realm, aspects of the practico-inert are going to be retained in whatever praxis you choose. So the practico-inert goes beyond the in itself. Okay, the in itself was more about physical matter, but the practical inert is kind of this intermediary ontological realm where past actions influence current praxis. I think using sedimentation is similar. I don't know exactly because I'm not as good with the German, but it sounds like a similar concept here. With the in itself, or unlike the in itself, the practical inert contains inertia that allows it to respond or act upon current praxis. So it's kind of like it pushes back against the things that we want to do. It's not just a background against which we build our project, but it's incorporated into and preserved into our project. So he actually uses words like counter-praxis or even anti-praxis, or counter-finality is another term that he uses to kind of capture this idea that the environment that we're implicated in, it often works against us. It often works directly against our aims. Sometimes the praxis that we put out there ends up in the exact opposite result of what we wanted, or at least it's skewed from what our original aim was. So here's a quote about praxis. He says, "Praxis always arises with an existing society. It is in fact never wholly natural. And as we have seen, it always expressed in techniques and social institutions, which transform it to the extent that it occurs within them." Okay. So he's saying, you know, your praxis, the things that you want to do with your free consciousness and your material activity, it's always expressed through a society. You know, you always end up interacting with institutions. You always end up interacting with, you know, the public, and with collective consciousness. And he says these things can actively hinder what you try to put out into the world and transforms it, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. So kind of categories of the practical inert that he talks about: human-made artifacts, bureaucracies, institutions. He has a whole thing in the critique about how, you know, labor unions are practical inert. Language, he even says the terms that we use. Social class, deeply ingrained ideas. Okay, so ideas that are so deeply embedded that they're just taken for granted and assumed to be true. These become part of, you know, we could say the backdrop of our field of experience, but it's not a neutral backdrop because it actively influences our praxis. It actively influences what we try to do. So this is a quote, and this also just shows how stark of a difference there was between like where Sartre was at in Being and Nothingness and where he's at now in the critique. He says, "Subjectivity then appears in all its abstraction as the verdict which compels us to carry out freely and through ourselves the sentence that society has pronounced upon us and which defines us a priori in our being. This is the level at which we shall encounter the practico inert." I mean, and this is pretty, I think, substantial and striking to hear, especially if, you know, if you're more in touch with Sartre's earlier work, where he's talking about existence precedes essence, and we'd have nothing, you know, we completely define ourselves, this very strong sense of freedom that he gives. He's actually saying that this defines us a priori. Something defines us before we come into the world. I mean, that's almost exact opposite of what he says in Existentialism as a Humanism. And he says, well, that thing that's there is the practical inert, because we don't come out of a blank slate. So because we emerge into the practical inert, the radical freedom that Sartre proposes in his earlier work is revised and limited in CDR. And this is how I kind of put it. Existence precedes essence, yes, but the practical inert precedes existence. So the practical inert is there before we are born into the world, before we emerge into the world. We are born into, you know, centuries of praxis, you know, that is kind of collected and reified and has been, you know, sedimented and kind of warped in all to form a social world that we have to interact with. So, and there's some really profound passages in CDR where he emphasizes this, that the words, or the thoughts that we can think, the words that we can speak, the ideas that we can imagine are all conditioned by the historical, material, and social realm. And he gives an example in the text of just a very impoverished woman in the global South, and basically, how much of what she has to do really has never been the object of intention. It's never been the object of choice in the way that would make it robustly or autonomously free in the way his earlier work wants to, because he says basically everything that she's done is geared towards her survival in this social material realm that she's implicated in. And what else can we really expect there? Even her whole thought process is going to be limited, and that goes for everybody, but it'll just be in different ways depending on what situation you occupy. But he definitely saw people who were more impoverished, more disadvantaged, as having even more greater limitations. And that's part of what influenced his later work, was seeing the ways that social, material, historical conditions are really going to be primarily defining for some situations. So in a way, our freedom restricts itself, because our free praxis, it's projected into the practical inert, and the results of our praxis are never exactly what we intend, because they are mediated by the practical inert. So our freedom, it's projected out there into the world, it sediments into the practical inert, it comes around full circle to restrict our possibilities in the future, and our freedom in the future. So it's almost paradoxical. He says it's human freedom that is creating the practical inert, and it's kind of coming back around to restrict itself. But what we see in his later works is that freedom is a negotiation of our consciousness, of our praxis, with existing practical inert categories, our social and material field. It's not the spontaneous, free, unconditional freedom anymore that we see. It's projected into this social realm that is often very limiting, and often twists or warps what we want to achieve. So, Sartre's earlier radical freedom is revised in light of his introduction of the practical inert realm and the limits that it places on our praxis. So I'll just say a little bit about my own thoughts to conclude here. Sartre's later conception of freedom accounts for materiality, for sociality, for historicity, and how these are integral components of what we think, say, and do, and the possibilities that we can even imagine. So, in my view, his later conception of freedom represents a significant improvement over the earlier conception, despite the fact that it's not as existentially fashionable. It might not be as in line with the traditional existentialist ideals. I do think it's actually an improvement upon some of the things that he says earlier, because I think he captures important things about the human experience that were left out of being a nothingness. And, some people criticize existentialism as a humanism for being very unrealistic and very idealistic. So I say, well, then you need to read the critique, or you need to read parts of Search for a Method, because you see a very different tone there. And I think you see a much deeper understanding of the human experience in these texts, that we still have this kind of free conscious activity, but it's limited a lot by the social material historical field. All right, so that is what I have for you. I'll stop there and I'll open up if anyone has any questions.
Yes, I do have a question. So when you were talking about the later Sartre, there were he spoke of consciousness in all of its abstraction, right? And then he talked about an a priori condition, right? Now, these words usually make somebody think of an intellect, what Merleau-Ponty called an intellectualist account of whatever it is that follows these words. Usually, when we think of abstract or a priori, these are trigger words for a Cartesian bias, right? But it seems he's not using them in this sense, right? He's saying it's a priori that, in fact, my projects are not complete. It's a priori that it's, in a way, completely a posteriori, right? Does this question make sense?
No, it does, and I think it's a good point to bring up. I don't think he means a priori in the Cartesian sense. I think you're absolutely correct by that. You know, you're implicated in a material field, but I think he's talking about the way that you said it was actually probably right. It's in other ways it's completely a posteriori, because you are what he's saying defines you is actually the results of human experience. It's not something that's totally there before any experience at all. But he's saying it's kind of there as you emerge into the world, like what you are born into, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think the way that you said it is correct.
Okay. Yeah, that works. That works. The reason I asked was because with the early Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, the differences are more or less clear to me. But with as you move towards the later Sartre, I started to encounter the same difficulties that Keli was having with the later Husserl and the Heidegger. It's very difficult to deploy the differences at that point.
Right. Yeah, I think they might have more in common later on than they did in their earlier years, for sure. I think that's very, very true.
Thank you for bringing up those later years. Again, admittedly, I get too obsessed with Husserl, and then I should be exploring other figures. But I was not as familiar with his critique and just how his concept of freedom had evolved. You know, you try to make a case for it in introductory classes, like, well, in existentialism, if someone's pointing a gun to your head, you still have a choice. But here we have an incorporation of these, you know, contextual limitations, and I appreciate that.
Right, and I think it's necessary to get like a full understanding of Sartre, and you know, I even look at some of the lectures he gave or the interviews he gave right before he died, and like what he said he wanted to be remembered for, and you know, he said he wanted to be remembered for these later works that people don't actually know that much about. So if we want to be true to like him and where he saw himself, I think we have to look at the later years, because I think he does do a better job there, like accounting for those objections you brought up, like with the gun to your head. It's like, no, that obviously is posing a very significant restraint on you, right? Yeah, you can still give value to that situation, but what does that mean in any type of meaningful practical sense? It doesn't mean much.
I'd like to propose this, and tell me if I'm off. I have this issue of just getting so upset at an author for one little thing that they said that I have a hard time just enjoying the rest of what they said. So he has these thoughts about the frigid woman, or the hand-holding example, or the waiter who was a little too eager to serve you and is operating in bad faith. Yeah. They don't recognize the freedom in their actions, and they believe they're behaving as a waiter should. And I waited tables for so long, and you know, as a woman, I get so upset at these examples. But I'm like, maybe this is Sartre realizing that no, the waiter's manager was in the corner with the clipboard, with the timer, seeing how long it took you to get to the table, and did you have a smile on the face? Why are you calling the server confused? You know, you're not in their little world. You don't know their little constraints. But I see here the possibility of maybe Sartre having some empathy, and not just
absolutely. Yeah, he definitely does. And even if you look at like his work Anti-Semite and Jew, which was still a fairly early work, but it was after Being in Nothingness, you know, he he talks in there about how you could attribute various attitudes of authenticity to different Jews living in France at that time. But then he says, how could we possibly blame them for these attitudes of authenticity? Look at the social situation that they were living in. Look at like the constraints that they were living in. They could not be authentically Jewish in French society at that time because they could be killed for it, or they could be, you know, immediately outed for it, or you know, discriminated against in various ways. So even before we get to the critique, some of those kind of middle essays that he did, he does show, you know, it's like, he's like, okay, you know, we have various attitudes of authenticity, inauthenticity, or perhaps bad faith, but they're very understandable, right? He's like, they're not morally we can't blame people for this. Like, what other option did they have other than bad faith? You know, it would be very, very rare for someone to be, you know, truly authentic in those types of situations.
Thank you for giving me a greater appreciation of Sartre.
Absolutely.
Any other questions, comments, revelations, connections? Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Kimberly Engels, for that wonderful presentation. You know, again, if questions come up later, we can address them. You know, I won't put you on the spot, but you know, if folks in our group have questions, maybe I can pick your brain or send people your way, or we'll get your questions answered. But that was a fantastic presentation, and I feel more enlightened by it. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. Now let us turn to Giorgi Vachnadze of Toulouse University. He's going to give us something on Merleau-Ponty. Take it away.
Thank you. So what's the time range here? Because I don't want to hold people for too long. I'm the last person presenting.
We have plenty of time. I was worried this might last till 4, but since we don't have a Fanon presenter, and I tried to keep my Heidegger and Husserl quick because I can go on. We've got time.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. So yeah, I mostly focused on his phenomenology of perception. So I'm gonna start with talking a little bit about his general worldview, his ontology, so to speak, or anti-ontology, however you'd like to conceive of it. And then I'll move on to his conception of freedom, which sort of emerges out of it. So the first thing an interesting thing about the phenomenology of perception is that, as was advised by Hubert Dreyfus, who is a great continental scholar, he's done work on Merleau-Ponty and Foucault, and he has a series of lectures that I highly recommend if somebody's looking for secondary insights on Merleau-Ponty. And he says a very interesting thing about the preface of the book, which is the magnum opus, you know, the main work done by Ponty, which is don't read the preface, is what he says, which is something that occurs in philosophy, as I've heard. The same thing was said about Wittgenstein's Tractatus. A lot of people say don't read the preface, it'll just confuse you. Actually, Wittgenstein said don't read the preface because it was written by Bertrand Russell. But interestingly, in Merleau-Ponty's case, it has to do with his artificial and insincere distancing of himself from Heidegger for very obvious reasons. And because he was a part of the French resistance, and he says that he draws mainly on Husserl, right? But that is completely wrong. In fact, he implicitly disagrees with Husserl radically, especially on his Kantianism, his Cartesianism, and generally what Merleau-Ponty labels the intellectualist school or the intellectualist tendency in philosophy. Okay, so the book is called The Phenomenology of Perception, and it's really not about perception, it's about the body. But that's how Merleau-Ponty defines perception. And I don't know how you define perception, but until I read The Phenomenology of Perception, I realized that I was suffering from a Cartesian bias when I was defining perception, because the way I defined perception was observation, right? Privileging the eye, privileging the ocular element of getting to understand the world of my life world, right? Oh, another fun fact about Merleau-Ponty is that he was the first director of the Husserl archives in Louvain. And having written my bachelor thesis as well as my master thesis in University of Louvain, the Center of Phenomenology, I didn't know that. I didn't know that he was the first, and Paul Ricoeur was the second one, I believe. So that was an interesting fact to know about him. Anyway, so when I thought about perception until Merleau-Ponty, I would think about observation. I would think of this like highly artificial situation where there's a sort of like bourgeois, armchair philosophizing. There's a cup on the table. I look at the cup. I perceive shapes and forms and lighting, and there's different aspects. And there's a lot of this in Husserl, right? There's the upshotting and the adumbrations of different aspects, and they converge onto the transcendental thing, right? The object in itself, so to speak. Merleau-Ponty is not quite postmodern yet, so he did influence the postmodern school, but he still believes in objects, that they are out there, that we can grasp them more or less transcendentally, but the way we grasp them is always in a manner that's embedded and situated. And the nature of this embeddedness is very interesting because it's fundamentally interactive. So when I think that I just see an object in space, sorry, I don't know what's wrong with my camera. So when I say that I see an object in space, that is considered as a fundamental element of my experience, as seeing an object in space. But what Merleau-Ponty reveals is that there's a complexity hidden behind what I call an object in space. Because children are not born with the ability to just see objects in space. I mean, it lies dormant as a capacity, of course, but the child needs to interact with objects with its body physically and grasp them before it can understand perspective and distance, right? So what we would perceive as a unity of perception for Merleau-Ponty hides a very diverse and a turbulent background of interactive behaviors. So it's because I have taken a cup, broken a cup, drank water from a cup. These are all the conditions that allow me to see an object in space. And strictly speaking, the object in space itself is a kind of a fiction because it's always situated in relation to what Sartre would call a project, right? So every object is already situated within a space of capacities, a space of actions and interactions, right? Of resistances and actions, right? And so I'm always embedded in a world. Drumming is a good example, actually, Cal. You brought the example of playing a drum set, right? I think playing drums or any instrument really, but I think especially the drums because it has to do with the rhythm of the idea of rhythm has become very popular in postmodern theory. So drums are interesting, right? Because there's a way in which the tool disappears, right? The drumstick disappears the more you get into the rhythm. And so the more you play, the less you think about the drumstick in your hand. So just like the Heideggerian hammer, it is the disappearance of the object that guarantees its proper use, its proper instrumental being in the world, right? Or in your surroundings, right? But it all has to do with the body, right? And it's important to note that Merleau-Ponty's conception of the body is not an empirical body, right? Because as I was researching Ponty, I noticed there was like an upsurge recently in biology, neuroscience, in these the natural sciences. There was this sort of blowing up of Merleau-Ponty scholarship, right? And as a Foucauldian, right, I looked at that with suspicion because I haven't dived into the literature, so I don't want to say something I won't be able to defend. But it had a reductionist flavor to it, the way they were using Merleau-Ponty. And if they are in fact using Merleau-Ponty to justify a reductionist stance on the body, as in to say something like, to oversimplify it, Merleau-Ponty says the body is the fundamental element of reality, and therefore we should look into biology, we should look into neuroscience because the body is so important, right? And there's a trap there because Merleau-Ponty has the most provocative and non-empirical conception of the body you can imagine. In fact, Merleau-Ponty's body is, I want to say, transcendent as opposed to transcendental, in the sense that I can never comprehend my own body. I am always situated vis-a-vis my own body. So I always have a fragmented conception of what my body is like, and no amount of research in biology or empirical sciences is going to help me comprehend my body in this absolute sense. But at the same time, I wouldn't even class Merleau-Ponty as a phenomenologist, because there is no inside with Merleau-Ponty, right? And I'm talking about a radical insight, I guess. A radical insight of both the early Sartre, as Dr. Engels discussed, as well as a radical insight of Husserl, less so with Heidegger. And so there's only an outside with Merleau-Ponty, right? And now, granted, this is a kind of postmodern reading, but I think it's a valid reading. There's no outside in the sense that no matter how I conceive of myself, it always has to do with abstracting from or using as the base material my corporeal experiences in the world. So even if I'm talking about my first person perspective or my consciousness, right, that is a construct that has emerged out of my interactive practices in the world, right? So with Merleau-Ponty, we are already and always and forever doomed to be embedded in the world. And there's no hidden consciousness behind it. There's no radical freedom behind it. And so freedom, and now I'm going to slowly move into the realm of freedom. Though I do think I need to talk a little more about what he terms intellectualism, right? Because I think there are elements, and a lot of scholars think that Merleau-Ponty's critique of Sartre's earlier conception of freedom has to do with a hidden Cartesianism that has remained dormant or has found its way into Sartre's ontology. And this radical or this absolute idea of freedom was also very reminiscent of what Keli said about the Kantian conception of reason, right? That somehow reasons are what is placed outside the nexus of practical engagement with reality, right? And so now that's a Cartesian idea, right? To say that my freedom comes from my mind, which is separate from the body, which operates like a deterministic machine, right? This is what Merleau-Ponty is fundamentally challenging when he's challenging the intellectualist account. Well, both the intellectualist and the empiricist, right? Because the intellectualist idealist says, I am not limited by my empirical body because I am pure consciousness, and that grants too much to the subject, that grants too much to the transcendental subject, that's too much freedom. You're living in your own fantasy, so to speak, right? But then the other extreme is the empirical world, which is also the other part of the Cartesian view, right? Which says that I have no freedom because I'm just a collection of atoms in space, and everything I do is determined by prior causes, and etc., etc. Classical reductionistic science, still very popular today. Right? And Merleau-Ponty says we have to find a balance between what is the in itself and the for itself, right? And so his argument is a kind of deconstruction, I want to say, of the in itself and the for itself, because the radicalness of their interconnectedness sort of dismantles them as standalone ontological structures, right? And so he makes the relationship between in itself and for itself so nuanced and so impossible to disentangle that it is almost fundamentally different from the way Sartre conceives of them, at least in his earlier work. And so already Merleau-Ponty here talks about negotiations and praxis. So he already says, not only, so he says, I have a choice, right? When I encounter the other on the conscious level, which in itself is an illusion because I have already encountered the other before. And I will talk about that as well. But he says, when I'm confronted by another person, I can think of them as a thing, right? I can reduce them. I can reduce them in purely manipulative terms. I can reduce them in economic terms as a thing, right? As an object. or I can reduce them in a biological or atomistic, and I can use science, I can use economics, or I can just be very manipulative, right? So in any way that I treat him in the Kantian sense, not as an end but as a means, is a reduction of the other to thinghood, right? And so on average, we could say that's pretty bad, right? And the other option is that treating the other as more or less the for itself, right? And so this is the difference, I guess, between him and the intellectualist school and maybe the early Sartre, right? Because I can't really posit him as an absolute consciousness, right? I would be, well, not just granting too much, but living the myth of radical freedom, right? So I have to say I will do my best to not treat this person as a means, and I can empathize with him. He's not an automaton, he's not a machine. So I do my best not to reduce the other to thinghood, right, or thingness. And I also resist the attempts of what Nietzsche calls the straitjacket of culture, right, to reduce me to an object, a thing, a proletariat, a bourgeois, right? I resist all of these labels, right? How? Because my body is pre-empirical. So it's not just pre-reflective, pre-reflexive, it's also pre-empirical. I have a pre-empirical body. And art has access to this pre-empirical body more so than science, right? And he talks about Cézanne a lot. He analyzes Cézanne, and Cézanne was diagnosed posthumously as a schizophrenic. Well, that was interesting from like a Deleuzian / Foucauldian reading of Merleau-Ponty, because schizophrenia is just symptom, like it's just, in many ways, schizophrenia is a form of resistance against a culture that wants to reduce us to thinghood. Partially, of course. I'm not denying the presence of suffering in patients or anything like that. But what he found interesting about Cézanne and expressionist art in general is that it reaches down to that pre-empirical level of embodiment. So there's a sense in which what people call abstract art or impressionistic art, where you just look at something and you're like, oh, that's a flower, but it looks nothing like a flower. I don't know why I'm immediately captivated by this image thinking it's a flower. And that's because the artist is a good phenomenologist, because the artist knows what happens to you or to a person before they can perceive an empirical object, right? So this relates back to what I said about perceiving objects in space. So what we perceive as a stable reality of just objects in space at this distance from each other, at this level of height, behind this, there's an ongoing work being done by our motor functions. Our motor functions are always in this turbulence of actively constructing these objects for us. And not to deny the existence of these objects, but not to believe too much in the existence of empirical reality the way science presents it or the way our senses present them to us. So we don't want to be naive realists here, right? But there is a pragmatist element here because, and this is where this begins to link up with the question of freedom, I feel resistance, right? I mean, I have a certain idea of what I want to do, and reality offers up its resistances, and I have to overcome obstacles, right? And so my freedom is more than limited, right? It's dependent on those obstacles, right? I posit them as obstacles, right? So there's a convergence with Sartre. I am the active participant in the creation of my obstacles, right? Not because the mountain's going to disappear after I decide not to climb it, but because it stops being a climbable object, it becomes a landscape object, it becomes some other type of object vis-a-vis my project, right? But it doesn't stop being a big mountain, right? This is Merleau-Ponty's point. Like you can never wish it away in respect to your body. Like you can never say, oh, you know what, actually this mountain is small, or it's not even a mountain. I mean, you would have to jump through hoops and you would have to get really uncomfortable in trying to defend that to yourself. But the point here being is that perceptual reality already has a spin to it. It's already dynamic, it's already in motion, and it's already meaningful, right? I do not place meaning in reality. Reality is already meaningful. And I want to make a connection here with the question of other and the question of intersubjectivity with Merleau-Ponty, because before I said that the other is an illusion. And why? Right? Because, and Keli, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but with Husserl, we have a phenomenology of consciousness, and then we have like a community of monads, right? And then there's a problem of knowing how the other person is as much of a monad as I am. Like, how do I know he has the first person perspective, right? I don't know how Husserl solves the problem. But the way Merleau-Ponty does it is, actually, I find it really cool, because he says, my consciousness is an illusion that has emerged out of a reality that is already intersubjective, right? So the whole problem is turned, it's turned upside down and it's turned inside out, because what he says is that, well, first he says, as we already said, the body is the fundamental element of being, right? But then it's very important to know this, and I never thought about this before. And it was sort of like a trivial psychoanalytic fact, but when you think about it in this way, in a corporeal way, the way Merleau-Ponty conceives of it, it sheds a very interesting light on this. I know people before I know objects, right? I mean, I come to understand people and go through a complex series of emotions before seeing one empirical object in front of me, right? And that's something that's very, very interesting, because I am prepped before my first encounter with an object. I am culturally, institutionally trained, right? That's a good word, because a lot of people say the Phenomenology of Perception is a book about sports. And in a way, it is a book about sports, because it talks about how much training we go through before we perceive what the scientist says is an empirical reality, right? Or even before the intellectualist says, I have a consciousness in the first person perspective. So the body beats both the empiricist and the intellectualist to the finish line before either one can even articulate the problem, right? And this throws a lot of philosophical questions out of the window. It throws out the question of radical skepticism, the question of what Wittgenstein called the private language and the impossibility of a private language. But more interestingly, the problem of private sensations, right? We don't have, like, the pain is not my pain. I think it's my pain, but it's not, because I was trained a series of cultural norms that I need to follow to express the fact that I'm feeling pain, right? So it reminds me actually of one of these little anecdotes from Wittgenstein's life when he was teaching in Cambridge and he was talking about pain. At one bizarre thing, he said that it is conceivable to feel a pain in another person's mouth, a toothache in another person's mouth, right? So keeping that weird analogy in mind, one of his students during his class, when he was talking about the possibility of private sensations, one of his students sort of slapped himself on the face and he said, "You cannot feel this pain." And Wittgenstein had an ingenious answer. He said, "Are you sure you know it?" You know, because knowing has to do with making things public. It has to do with articulating something, right? So Wittgenstein had a high standard for what it means to know something. It was not the phenomenologist standard. But we can invert this thing in a way, and we can say that we are trained to feel pain and react to pain in a way that we don't have access to that sort of like primordial pain before I was taught the word pain. And so I don't have private sensations, right? So the moment I'm born and trained, and when I look to the other, when I'm a child, I look to my mother, to my father, and I slowly construct my own body image, which culminates in the mirror, right? And that's Lacan's famous example as well. The mirror stage culminates, reaches a sort of an important threshold in my perception of my body, but it's still not a complete one, because there's infinite adumbrations of myself in the mirror, right? And then that further, of course, becomes complicated through social roles and my role in society and who I am, but the symbolic structure, as Lacan refers to it. But the interesting thing is that there's not just an intersubjectivity, that's pre-given before subjectivity. There's an intercorporeality that is given before I think of my body as separate from that of the other. So my body being separate and individuated is itself a construct that emerges out of an intercorporeality, just like my subjectivity is something that sort of detaches itself in a very artificial way and separates itself off, or thinks it separates itself off from intersubjectivity. Now, what does this have to do with freedom, right? Well, the biggest mistake, the biggest act of unfreedom, according to Merleau-Ponty, is this Cartesian instinct, which is in a way a scientific instinct as well, to separate my actions into meaningful units and to say, here's an action that's free, here's an action that's not, right? And as though I can come up with thought experiments in which I can give you a perfect example of a free action. I can't. It's impossible. Because we cannot separate a free action from a background of unfree actions, right? So just like in perception, there's a phenomenal field around me that doesn't have any clear boundaries around it. I focus on this object or that object, and this one comes into focus, that one recedes in the background, but there's never a strict separation between objects. And there's never a clear boundary that separates my perceptual horizon. So we have a similar thing with freedom. We have a field of freedom. And whether an action is free or unfree is an ongoing work. Ongoing work of reliving the action, thinking about the action, putting the action into different contexts. And so, for instance, the process of clarifying what it means to be free is a process that is punctuated with moments of freedom and unfreedom, right? So every single one of my action. So just like consciousness is an abstraction that is built out of my embedded interactive practice in the world, similarly, the same thing goes for freedom or a free action. These are artificial unities. They may help us navigate the world and discuss some questions about freedom and philosophy, but they are not real in the embodied sense, in the embedded sense. They are abstractions. And so they mislead us. They mislead us in many ways. For instance, they mislead us in thinking of, I guess, a version of Sartre annihilation or negation, right? Merleau-Ponty says there's a sense in which I cannot negate, because the moment I negate, I just start on doing something else, right? I can disengage from this lecture right now, but I cannot disengage from looking at my nails or pretending I'm not here, or that energy, it will be reinvested somewhere else, right? So I don't have a realm of nothingness. I don't have a realm of pure consciousness to which I could recede and say no, right? I can't just say no, because the moment I say no, I say yes to something else, right? And just to complicate things further, he brings examples, right? He brings examples of the proletarian revolution. He offers a critique of Marxism. And he brings an example of torture, right? And he says that, and aside from that, he one of the more general examples is that he said a slave can be free either in the act of breaking its chains or deciding to remain in unfreedom. So these can equally be acts of freedom, right? But as you said in the introduction, Keli, right, we have stereotypical ways of conceiving of freedom, right? So breaking chains would never be associated with being free. The other way around, breaking chains is always associated with being free, and refusing to resist the situation is always considered an act of unfreedom. But we can bring a very Foucauldian example here, right? I can choose to go to prison because I find society much more constraining. Right, I can say that being sort of an active liberal entrepreneur is much more taxing on me, and the demands of society, what they call striving and flourishing, these make me feel more unfree because I always have to be in the act of producing my own freedom, and that's taxing and it requires discipline. And I would rather be in prison where I get to read books or contemplate life, And for me, I find more freedom in this than in what society has to offer. So I can place myself in exile. I can place myself in a state of exception. I can place myself into situations that on average are considered to be constraining. And I can find freedom in those situations. And so he brings the example of torture. And he says, a captive being tortured, refusing to give the information, to provide the information of the whereabouts of his associates, can be seen as an act of unfreedom. Why? Because first of all, he has trained himself to resist such situations. Secondly, he thinks about his friendships. He thinks about the other people. He thinks, what would they think about me? Right? So there is a structural chain, a field within which he is already placed. And that is the field that does the resisting for him. It does the job for him. So even in our most radical acts of freedom, there are elements of those freedom which carry us. Right? So if I decide to become a great warrior and I do become a great warrior, there's a sense in which I was already a great warrior. And that smacks of determinism, right? If I was already a warrior, then that was not a completely free action because that was sort of lying dormant in me. But not in this clear sort of complete sense of a warrior, but a jumble of institutional games, right? A jumble of various definitions of warriorhood. Family resemblances, as Wittgenstein would say, right? So even though I might speak of a free act, that free act hides beneath itself a series of discordant family resemblance games, different language games of what it means to be free. And these in turn are embedded in corporeal practices, right? So back to the body. The body is not a unity. It's not a fixed unity. It's located at the cross-section of various institutional definitions of who and what I am or could be, right? So it's more like brambles, right? I think of brambles when I think about this, right? Or rhizome is the popular term, right? Rhizomatic. The body's rhizomatic in the sense that it is a set of functional relationships and not a matter. It's not a unity. It doesn't have a unity. It's dispersed fundamentally. And so in this sense, our lives are woven with freedom. So everything we do is already woven with freedom, depending on how we negotiate our being in the world, right? And so it's an irreducible complexity, right? There's not a structure beneath it. There is not a radical freedom beneath it. There's nothing beneath it. We construct ourselves as we go. And that is something that holds great appeal to me because I think that predicts a lot of what Foucault was doing. But yeah, I'm not going to talk about Foucault now. So yeah, that's it. Thank you. Questions, right?
Oh, thank you. I wanted to answer that Husserl part, and then I have another question, but I don't want to dominate. Husserl would say that we recognize the other as a monad through the lived body, because we see that this body is motivated by more than just physical or impulsive things. There's a reflective judgment going on. Now we have to perform the reduction in order to see the pattern of the monad. There's an otherness transcendentally built into our conscious perception and those structures of intentionality. Personally, in our own otherness, we see an other self in the past that is continuous with ourself now, and that is continuous with ourselves in the future. So I kind of explained this in terms of self, but I'm glad that you brought up that monad of the other and how that shows up in the body. But I do think that is a point of comparison and contrast. So yes, the body is crucial for recognizing the other as an other monad, but we're still construing things in terms of monads and reflection, and we have to go through Husserl's rigmarole, his scientific rigmarole, in order to see precisely and distinguish, detangle those monadic sort of motivations and other motivations in the body. So that was that point. But I have a question about sort of this this negotiation, and how maybe exiling yourself or placing yourself in prison, just saying yes to that, if there are sort of parallels to Stoicism there. Now, I don't know all that much about Stoicism. I've just been reading about it recently, but it seems like certain extreme forms are just passive reception, and something terrible happens and you go, oh, well, that's just the case. Oh, I'm a slave now. Well, I guess I'm a slave now. I still have freedom of judgment, but that's, here we go. So I wonder if there are parallels there to be drawn.
Yes. Definitely, yeah. There's definitely parallels to Stoicism, and I do. Jesus, what is wrong with the camera? And I do do some work on Stoicism, because I guess this is not stopping. So, all right. So because Foucault was infatuated with Stoicism, because Foucault thought Stoicism was the golden age where power was at its minimum in terms of how constraining it was. But at the same time, it was one of the most terrible periods in ancient history. I mean, it was a pure statelessness, so to speak. And so Stoicism was, in a way, a reactive hysteria against the loss of structure, of infrastructure. But apparently, as a result of that, right? What's the saying? Tough times breed strong people, or something, something like that. And so that resulted in a system that was very open. It was very practical, and it was like a very rule of thumbs type of thing. So there was none of this like Leibnizian construction of complex systems. There was none of this like calculus type speculative theorization. So it was very down to earth. They had rules of thumb, but at the same time they had a sort of like cosmological view of the universe. So it was highly spiritual, while at the same time it remained highly pragmatic. Because what they required at that moment was a set of simple solutions and therapy. So, so the cosmological view is what provides the therapeutic aspect of Stoicism, feeling that you're part of nature, you're part of the big picture, you're not alone, even when you are, physically or in the more literal terms alone, you're never alone. And so Foucault thought precisely in the sense that you asked in relation to going to prison or going to exile willingly. Foucault said that when we practice paresia, courageous truth, we might be thrown into situations that are unpleasant, and we must not only be ready for that through the use of largely or partially Stoic practices. But sometimes maybe it's a good idea to just practice Stoicism, because it will automatically result in resistance, as in your lifestyle itself will be resistant to the power structure. And so it's cultivating a type of Lebenswelt, right, that would be conducive of not just a happy and fulfilling life, but would remain harshly political and resistant to the order of things, right? So that's the connection with Stoicism, I think.
Oh, thank you. Other questions, comments, connections? How are we doing in the chat? Y'all hanging out, having a good time? I hope so. Ah. Any concluding remarks, connections, revelations, questions, anything else? Well, Giorgi, thank you so much for that presentation. Thank you, Dr. Kimberly Engels. Thank you, Zachary Baylog, for being here. Thank you for our participants hanging out, Gerald and Jose. Great to have you here. And thank you all for watching at home. This concludes our installment of the Chop Shop series on freedom. Be on the lookout for more to come, and please do reach out to me or to us for questions, and we'll help you along the way. All right. Goodbye, everyone.